So the first lecture is Renee Chow. Renee, she's a professor in architecture and urban design at Berkeley University and a principal at Studio Urbis. Renee, she focuses her practice and research on the intersection between architecture and its local. Please welcome Renee.
I want to thank all of you, SUDes, for inviting me, and all the guests. Peter, thank you so much. Axon Johnson as well for sponsoring all of this. Much appreciative about being part of this event. I want to thank you all for framing these talks under a rubric of performative places. Thank you, Harrison. I also want to thank you for giving us the rubric of performative spaces. Urbanism is not only about how cities look, but how they're experienced, used, associated with, perform, both in terms of quantitative and qualitative metrics. City design has never been more important, and never has it been more problematic. As our world faces new and complex challenges, our cities will need to be made more dense, more accommodating of diverse populations, more robust. Yet the methods and knowledge we employ in their design is not advancing. We have more data, but less sense, like in how a street supports activities beyond traffic. Computation and big data are emerging as tools to model urban complexity, yet these models are premised on a too simple, bifurcated view of cities. Mostly it's inside and outside. The rich interrelations that weave the pieces of a city together into a fabric, and urbanism, there's Lund on the right, are difficult to represent in the design process. This is where the core of my research work, teaching, professional practice is directed, and what I will discuss today: the language, generative tools, and systemic metrics of relational conditions that support the design of better cities and extended places. To begin today's conversation, I'd like to introduce three themes that will be woven throughout my talk: fields, figures, and fragments. I use the term field to describe the relational forces that weave urban fabrics. The term field has associations with the sciences, as in force and vector fields, with landscape, as in agrarian and playing fields, as well as with the arts, as in visual fields. All use the term to describe shared relations, the ways in which parts act upon each other, connect, and propagate. I'm certainly not the first to use the term. My understanding grows from the work of Team 10, particularly Alison Smithson, Aldo Van Eyck, Giancarlo De Carlo, from Jorge Kepish and Kevin Lynch at MIT when I was a student there, and more recently from James Corner and Stan Allen. Perhaps all trace their lineage to Einstein's publication of the theory of relativity, a breakthrough in the theory of electrodynamics, or a theory of space, that paralleled the theory of thermodynamics, or mass. Now there's a concept: a theory of relations and a theory of mass. Two points of view that work in parallel. The key for the built environment as well is that there's a spectrum between which the world can be seen and designed as both figure and field. So quickly, I'd like to just use this fishbowl as an illustration. What is it that you see? Some people would answer that question by highlighting the objects, the figural pieces in the image. So they see the fish or the flower. Others, as the quote says, appear to think more holistically. They're looking for the relational conditions, the fish sizes, or the fish moving in relation to each other. Oh, the fish happen to be nearly the same size as the leaves. Or the sense that there's gravity that is invisible, the hidden relations that are pulling the plants upward. So suddenly, there are both figures and fields. I'd like to give another example. In this case, let's look at an urban fabric. This is the Hutung in Beijing. I'll be using China and other Asian cities to illustrate today's talk. In part, China, because it's the rapid growth of Asian cities magnifies the issues that I'll be talking about. In part, I've just finished a book on Chinese urbanism, and in part because I know that you are doing a collaboration with Beida, so it seems appropriate. The SUDes is a vessel for social construction of everyday life of Chinese families. A history of Chinese settlement, both city and country, revolves around these courtyard compounds. Whether for housing or retail, administration or religion, activities took place within a fabric of platforms, walls, screens, columns, and roofs. Most depictions of the SUDes are figural, an abstracting of the courtyard compound removed from its context. 4 pavilions are aligned to form a courtyard space between them. A garden wall runs around the perimeter, making a perfect rectangle and the cultural ideal for a home for the extended Chinese family. Yet if we look at this fabric more carefully, this is the hutong today, and even compare it to the 1750 Qianlong plan of Beijing, it's difficult to find this figure. Can you find that perfect rectangle? The urban fabric of the hutong was not and is not a replication of rectangles as units. It is a field of pavilions organized in relationship to sunlight that is then infilled with walls that shift over time to form family compounds in relation with neighboring compounds. This organization for sunlight is a loose or open relation of pavilions. Regardless of how the garden walls are changed, sunlight always enters the fabric. As a field, this reflects the reality of the ideal family. It reflects that the ideal family was not always possible, and in fact, the compound walls could shift to accommodate the changes in lifestyle. The city's urban legibility is informed by these open fabrics. Despite the wall-lined streets and alleys that characterize old Beijing, Beijing is easily navigated through a directionality of longitude and latitude and in relationship to city center. This strong directionality is formed by the courtyard fabric, which expands easily in the east-west direction, but must be more frequently interrupted in the north-south direction. The lesson? There's a reciprocity, a relativity between the smallest unit of the urban fabric with the identity and legibility of the entire city. There's a reciprocity between public and private realms. There's a reciprocity between inside and outside. These are critical field conditions that we are losing the competency to design and for which our urban design tools too frequently ignore. Shanghai. What we see now is a move towards the design and development of the components of our cities. The buildings, the parks, streets and highways, they're all becoming objects. The debate about figures and fields accelerated in the mid-20th century, of course. In response to urban fabrics which had become overcrowded and unsafe, CM produced a manifesto for rational cities in which streets were hierarchic and functions were segregated. Dwelling was isolated in towers and distributed within parks to ensure that urban centers could be both dense and sunlit. The lures of mass production and automotive and building technologies, coupled with the imperatives of health and safety, overrode the concern for urban legibility and locale. This tabula rasa approach has been adopted by generations of architects, planners, and policymakers, especially during waves of large-scale reconstruction, as evidenced in post-war America and today in contemporary China. There was, of course, a backlash to this approach. With CM, the disagreement about the charter led to the emergence of Team 10. In the United States, Jane Jacobs put forth her famed rebuke of modernist planning principles. In her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, the very first line of the book reads, "This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding." She used New York as her primary case study, deriding the figural monotony, fragmenting boundaries, and the loss of the fine-grained and diverse social and economic complexities necessary for a healthy city. While the debate over what constituted good cities continued, I think the culture of object building evolved. A convergence of immense concentrations of capital, an assumption about cheap energy, and vertical technologies fostered a building culture dominated by icons to corporate and individual wealth. In 1978, Rem Koolhaas also used Manhattan as case study to describe urbanism and what he called its terminal stages. Terminal stages. It's the end game. It's like cancer. And he called buildings were so large they become automonuments, even if they do not deserve such symbolism. He described urban living as lobotomized, splitting inside from outside, block from block, public from private. So, while traditional settlements as fields emerged from cultural practices that no single identity could claim, 20th century development commodified building as individual brands. To overly caricature, governments wanted monuments, corporations wanted icons, architects, we want recognition, and developers want brand identity. Taken together, design gravitated towards the simplicity and reward of signature figures and fragments with the potentials of fields overlooked. At a time when architecture and urban design are dominated by multinational firms and brand name designs, the aggregation of the extraordinary is becoming a burden on the ordinary. The experiences of cities are becoming a globally familiar cacophony of discrete interventions designed intentionally to stand out from the rest. These figures splinter everyday life in the city. The urban fabric is disconnected, illegible, disorienting, monotonous, and self-serving. If we are to sustain or even increase the quality and legibility of our cities, we need compelling alternatives that shift development and design from only using figures and objects. If we are to make our cities sustainable, both in terms of resources and culture, we need the tools and metrics that let us look at the potentials of the scale of the neighborhood and the district, as well as buildings and the region. We need tools that describe the field as well as the figure. To illustrate, I'd like to show 3 case studies. The first is in the city of Tianjin, China, done in collaboration with the Tianjin Urban Planning and Design Institute. So these next 3 projects are all projects that I've done with my students at Berkeley. Despite all the rapid growth in Tianjin, there's a 200-hectare, 500-acre district in the heart of old Tianjin that is unusually low density and has seen little development in the last century. So the red dot is the project site, and what you can see is how Tianjin has grown around the site, but because the site is historically preserved, nothing has been done. But it's of course facing enormous development pressure. The goal was to develop an urban fabric that reinforced the legibility of the city, that served as a transition between the historic district and the urban towers that surround it, and that revitalized the historic district with mixed-use activities. In this case, what I'd like to illustrate is how relations were described and used as design parameters for collaborations among designers. The experiment benefited from having 14 willing designers prepared and inclined to use systems to describe relations between their individual designs. In developing the parameters, every system of the field was a configuration overlaid on other systems. You're looking at some of the initial studies. We began by assuming that any urban armature should begin with passive strategies and then apply technologies, and that every system operates in an optimum that differs from other systems. So our ambition was to integrate systems, not make them closed loop. Here's what we came to agree on as the key systems that were the initial starting point for the design guidelines. Very simply, they were walls, water, wind, and sun. So first, connecting with walls. In Wu Dada, we extended the walled characteristics of the historic fabric, which is to the bottom of the image, into the site. A field of demising walls, long and short, in the historic fabric are extended onto and transformed on the project site as a field of wall zones. And these are some of the design interpretations. Next, we looked at stormwater. Tianjin receives 70% of its annual rainfall during the summer, so flooding and water shortages are a recurring pattern. Remediation through in-ground water systems is made difficult by impervious soil conditions. As a result, stormwater is managed above ground at multiple urban levels. An elevated collection system provides a new ground for activities internal to the site that could be developed as a green belt from the retained water. And again, here are some of the design interpretations. Another goal was to provide natural ventilation across the site, ensuring summer breezes and blocking winter winds, especially to the residential units. And last was permeability of sun. Revitalizing Wudadai required increasing the number of people living near the site. Therefore, a large portion of this fabric needed to be residential, requiring that parts of the site meet the Chinese sunlight code. On the bottom, you can see the sunlight intervals that were introduced where building masses were paired with shadow zones, so that each designer was responsible for the shadow that his or her building cast on the remainder of the site. The more impervious the building, the less ground development was possible. With the field parameters in place, designers then worked individually. In fact, they barely talked with each other because we had hardly any time left in the semester. But very quickly and with very little need for discussion, the major continuities of the site emerged with what I think is a finely woven integration of public and private spaces, where no space was left over or unused. My second illustration is a canal village on the outskirts of Shanghai. This was a competition sponsored by the Shanghai Qingpu government. The competition brief called for schemes that would bring back the awareness of natural evolution of man-made habitats, inspire a new paradigm of city development, one that is neither urbanism nor suburbanism, and provoke, and this is my favorite part, a dialogue between Chinese heritage and contemporary living. For a nation that's been busy destroying large parts of their urban fabric, it was a relief to hear that they were interested in trying to maintain that. What I'd like to illustrate here in relation to the potentials of field urbanism is how to read a locale, its heritage in this case, and extend its lessons to build contemporary urban fabrics. Like Shanghai, this project site sits in the Yangtze River Delta. To make productive agricultural fields from these flood-prone lands, the region is a system of ponds and canals with dikes and levees to control drainage and provide irrigation. The land is divided into long, thin parcels that radiate perpendicularly from the edges of the canal. It is a low-tech, decentralized system, doesn't require lots of maintenance, and enables good overall agricultural and drainage performance. It's been working for centuries. A distinctive group of towns and villages has grown out of this landscape. Zhujiao is one of these villages. As metropolitan Shanghai develops, this landscape now faces the pressure of suburban development, all too familiar. By now, I hope it's becoming explicit that we need to be able to read local relations as systems. This affords designers the knowledge and tools to both connect to and extend the unique urbanism of a place, and to describe the interwoven and nested interior quality of a fabric. What this project will show is that urban systems and architectural systems need to be mapped as a thick mat, as overlays both as a variety of scales and at the same scale. So here are a series of mappings of the historic center. This illustration shows the public perception of the village, much like the Noli plan of Rome. Here you see the party walls that are direct extensions of the levees that radiate from the canals. Here in yellow you see the public access highlighted, and you can see that public access runs parallel to the canals. This is the residential access. It runs perpendicular to the water, along the party walls, through an alternation of buildings and courtyards. So the residential experience is very much to and from the water, public experience parallel to the water. And deep in the fabric are the large houses and temples, the buildings that are distinctive objects or figures, yet integrated into the fabric. Here's a set of diagrams exploring the same set of systems at a local scale. Our design goal is to introduce contemporary ways of living by extending, transforming, and adding spatial practices that are unique to this landscape. Again, I'll just show this looking one system at a time. Here what you see is the primacy of water. A new dwelling fabric needs to maintain the stormwater pattern of the region. The walls are extended as zones and the increments are widened to accommodate new densities. Major public access continues to move parallel to the canals, and the neighborhoods and their access continue to radiate to and from the water. Sunlight in the historic field is a checkerboard pattern, ensuring sunlight and air in what is a very temperate climate. What we discovered is the same pattern fails when we had to increase the building heights to change the density. So in this case, we had to transform the built and open pattern into alternating strips that met the Chinese daylight code. The preference for south-facing housing is provided at the scale of the unit rather than at the scale of the building. And then new services like parking, fire access, garbage, servicing were layered into the field to intensify the experience of the water. This scheme introduces servicing as a topographic system, again a new elevated ground. Community activities take place on the new ground with parking located below. The resulting design parameters, again, trying to describe a thick ground, describe the conditions of an urban fabric in a very different way than the traditional site plan and master plan, and I think then results in what I hope is a different urban fabric. One, there's a multiplicity of systems that connect local with extended sites. Two, the systems are a thick mat that describe the reciprocities between large and small, public and private. The systems then are guidelines that allow building form to emerge, describing the key attributes to be shared, but provoking variation, both for initial collaboration and over time. As a result of describing the relational conditions and masses as sizes smaller than the building, we were able to develop an urban fabric, one with richly woven experiences at all sizes, that are integrated with the water system of the landscape, and that offer variation and choice for the resident, and that allows the designers to do more than decorate the outside and fill out the inside. The last case study is in Hanoi. You'll see the work of 2 teams of students for a competition that's sponsored by the National University of Singapore as part of their Vertical Cities Asia competition. The intent of the competition is to develop new paradigms for high-density living. In this case, they set a goal of 100,000 people in 1 square kilometer with a theme of urban farming and a site, unfortunately, not in Hanoi, but on the outskirts of Hanoi, so it's a greenfield site. While there's not enough time to go through the details of the project, what I'd like to illustrate with this last case study is the reading of relationships already embedded in the control of water, again in an agrarian landscape, and their transformation into relational design parameters. This time I won't describe all the field parameters, but instead the resulting form and how the systems underlay the urban fabric. We began the project developing both the quantitative and qualitative metrics. What did the numbers of the brief mean in relation to known places and the culture of Vietnam? We discovered that the numbers, 100,000 people in 1 square kilometer, did not imply that the form of the city had to be in vertical object containers, and that strong horizontal development was possible. We studied the form of housing in the rural landscape as well as in the city. We looked at crops and the food chain. We looked at stormwater, the control of the farming, the watershed, and the existing agrarian systems. The final proposal was integrated commercial farming along the dominant water channels become a framework for the city. Here you see the major waterways. The major waterways are running north-south, and then you see these green urban farms that are growing across the city. They become what the students called farmways, ways in which you could move through the cities and experience the urban agriculture. With all these examples, I hope I've illustrated alternatives, both representational and systemic, towards designing good urbanism through using fields as well as figures. Aldo van Eyck said, good urbanism is when the experience of the city makes you feel inside, even if it happens to be outside. We need to consider the impact of design interventions at all scales, from the largest to the smallest. In this way, no space is left over, a no man's land between built projects. I believe good urbanism is local. It's about being somewhere, not anywhere. I'd like to conclude, since I knew I was first today, with questions for the rest of our speakers and for you as students of urban design. At least for us, these are the questions that emerged from these projects that we worked on. One, how can designers better understand locales? Global practice does not mean the end of local differences. Since cultural practices are intertwined with the particulars of locale, what is needed are professional competences in reading local conditions with the goal of connecting to that which makes cities unique, their identities and legibilities. How does a connected, continuous inside character of place get developed? Horizontal relations and ground continuities are particularly important to bring pieces of a city together in legible ways. This is not the ground plane, like a little thin thing that you see in the master plans with trees lining the streets, but it's a zone or a thick mat associated with the ground. It is what happens at grade, below grade, and above grade. This is the continuously shared experience of the city. In urban design, large must be integrated with small, public with collective and private, the different efficiencies of repetition with the complexity of diversity, and the thematic qualities of identifiable places with the richness of variety. 3, how can we build better design tools that make urban forms, not object forms, more compelling? Our dependence on master plans that bifurcate the city between inside and outside, tools such as massing models, figure ground drawings, and street sections that cut us off right at the edge of the building, they're not sufficient. Holding continuity solely in the public realm is also not sufficient. The private realm must also be integrated with the public. To understand urban design is contributing to an extended setting, we need strategies to integrate urban and building systems that do not control by prefiguring architecture within building envelopes, but instead allow urbanism to emerge. This is a convergence of city relations with building relations. And last, how can design actions be better integrated? With the disappearance of development through type, most super projects emerge from the hand of a single designer now, as a mega project, mega form, or master plan. In a good design hand, this is a pretty daunting task. In lesser hands, this leads to repetition and uniformity. Alternate tactics are needed to coordinate and integrate the rich diversity and complexity that comes from multiple voices and agents that still hold coherence among the parts. Urban design should enable agency, both as collaboration and over time. A shift or addition of a relational paradigm empowers the architect and architecture in city design. As we build more densely, we should expect to get more. Greater variety of ways to gather, new scales of building that decrease resource consumption, and a capacity to accommodate inevitable change. So thank you. My lesson for today, look for patterns. They're everywhere.
Thank you, Renee. I think actually we have a little time, since you're so good to keep your time. So if there are any questions from the audience, that would be good to take them right away. Anything?
They're just waking up.
Yeah, that's true. But you know what I thought was really interesting that you said? You said that no space was left over or unused. I think the notion of leftover space is what we are almost seeing every day. That how can we use that, and how to make sure that it's not over-designed, but to find a balance, that you actually need the space to be open space. So, I mean, with the parameters all the students used, how did they look into that?
Well, it was interesting, and again, because if you have designers establishing the parameters together, they seem to understand and read it. But what happened was the parameters said that you had to describe relationships between different parcels. So what happened was any spaces between buildings were already considered as either public or collective spaces. So I guess my argument is that if you start to think about the relations at the beginning rather than afterward and try to fill in between them, that's useful.
Then you're the master. Yeah. I think that's really important in the urban fabric, to actually try to find that balance. And with the parameters, sometimes the parameters can overwhelm, because then you always have to check you have the right things. So of course, when you have this thick layer that you say with a connection between all the different things, so how to actually balance that? Was that a big discussions in the student groups, or was that more like, or did the client ask for some of these issues?
In the first case, the client did ask for it. We had to meet a certain density threshold. So we could, of course, include taller towers within the building, but as they came to the ground, they were already tied into a network. So the bottom four stories of the building were already kind of described as a public, collective, private set of relations from which independent projects could emerge above that.
Very well. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.